It happened so fast, I still replay the sound in my head every time I close my eyes. The sharp crack of the gunshot split the air like thunder on a clear day, unnatural, violent, out of place in a space meant for laughter and swings and tiny footsteps. I remember the way the birds took off from the trees, startled. I remember the children freezing mid-play, toys dropping from their hands, eyes wide in shock. And then I heard it, my daughter scream, not the kind of scream she let out when she scraped her knee or dropped her ice cream. This was different. This was raw, high-pitched, and filled with a pain I had never heard from her before. I turned, heart already pounding, and saw her lying on the ground near the sandbox, blood blooming on her shirt like ink in water. Her walker lay a few feet away, twisted and useless. She wasn't moving. For a second, I couldn't either. My legs just wouldn't work. Then I saw her. Karen, still standing there holding the gun, her hands trembling but her face terrifyingly calm. Her mouth moved, but the words didn't register. Someone shouted. A woman grabbed her child and ran. Another parent dropped to their knees beside my daughter, pressing their hands down on the wound. I was screaming but couldn't hear myself over the ringing in my ears. The sirens came quickly, but not quickly enough. The police arrived, guns drawn, chaos erupting on what had been a sunny school afternoon. Karen stood there, like nothing happened, like this was just another disagreement. When the officers approached her, she pointed at my daughter and calmly said it was self-defense. She was threatening me. My child, my disabled 9-year-old. She said my daughter was threatening her. That's when everything around me collapsed into white noise. A playground, a gun, a lie so big it nearly stole everything. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't going to be just about blood and bandages. It was going to be about truth and justice and whether anyone would believe us. She shot my daughter and then said it was self-defense. Before everything shattered, life had finally started to feel manageable again. We had just moved into a quiet, well-kept community where the lawns were always trimmed and the playground was always filled with laughter. It felt like a place where people looked out for each other, where a child could grow up safe, and where a mother like me, exhausted, hopeful, and endlessly protective, could finally breathe. After years of living in cramped apartments with broken elevators, cracked sidewalks, and too many stairs, this new neighborhood felt like a small victory. For the first time in a long while, I saw the sparkle in my daughter's eyes return, not the kind that came from cartoons or candy, but the deep kind, the kind that shines when a child feels free. Ava was born with a rare neuromuscular condition that weakened her legs and made walking difficult without a mobility aid. Most days, she used a walker, pink, with little butterfly stickers she had carefully arranged along the handles. Some days, she managed short distances on her own, holding onto walls or rails, grinning like she had conquered a mountain. She had a laugh that could flip the worst days right side up, and a spirit so bright it made strangers smile at grocery stores. She was brave in ways adults don't even understand, always getting up when she fell, always asking if she could try one more time. In the first few weeks after moving in, she made it a mission to learn the names of every tree on our block. She memorized the layout of the new school and counted the ramps like trophies. She loved the playground most of all, the smooth ramps, the rubber flooring, the swings that allowed her to fly without needing to run. I'd sit on the bench with my coffee and just watch. For once, she didn't stick out. For once, she was just a kid on the playground. We'd wave at neighbors, exchange casual hellos, and sometimes even join the other parents during community events in the park. It was the kind of normal I used to pray for when she was in and out of hospitals, and for a while, I believed we had finally found our version of peace. But peace is fragile, and some people are bothered by things they don't understand. That's when we first noticed her, Karen. She lived 3 doors down, always impeccably dressed, always with a clipboard in her hand and a scowl on her face. I remember the first time she approached us. It was about the chalk drawings Ava had made on the sidewalk. Nothing offensive, just flowers, suns, and Ava's name with a heart beside it. But Karen said it looked messy and violated the HOA's policy on curb appeal. I laughed it off at first, assuming she was just one of those meticulous types who valued order over fun. But the more we saw her, the more that uncomfortable feeling in my chest grew. She would stop and stare if Ava used the playground too long. Once, she made a sarcastic comment about the walker. That thing sure takes up a lot of space, doesn't it? I tried to reason that maybe she didn't realize how her words sounded. Maybe she was awkward or socially clumsy. But the tension lingered like smoke from a distant fire, faint but always there. Still, I held on to the good. The neighbors who smiled, the school that embraced Ava with open arms, the new teachers who saw her potential instead of her limitations. Our home had a sunroom Ava loved to read in, and every evening we'd play her favorite board games at the kitchen table, laughing as she insisted she wasn't cheating, just strategizing. She even made a new friend, Ella, who lived across the street. They'd race each other, Ava with her walker, Ella cheering her on, both of them laughing so hard they'd collapse into giggles on the grass. For the first time in years, our life had routine joy and hope. But deep down, I kept feeling this unease every time I saw Karen at the HOA meetings, whispering to other board members, casting long glances at our home when she thought we weren't looking. It felt like she was watching us, not in the way a neighbor watches out for you, but in the way someone counts the minutes you've overstayed your welcome. I told myself I was imagining it, that we were overthinking, that not everyone would understand Ava right away, and that was okay. We just had to be patient. Kindness would win. Community would win. I didn't know that beneath the manicured lawns and shiny HOA newsletters, something darker was festering. I didn't know that some people look at difference not with curiosity or compassion, but with resentment and fear. I didn't know that one day, the woman 3 doors down would bring a gun to a playground. I didn't know peace could be this temporary. All I knew then was that my daughter was happy, and for a mother like me, that felt like everything. Until it wasn't. Looking back, I wish I had paid more attention to the signs, the tiny cracks forming beneath the surface of our peaceful new life. At first, they were barely noticeable, like faint scratches on glass. But they grew slowly and relentlessly until they shattered everything. It started with a letter, folded neatly, hand-delivered, not mailed. No greeting, no signature, just an official HOA letterhead with a typed notice, sidewalk chalk drawings must be removed within 24 hours. Failure to comply may result in a fine. I stared at it for a few moments, confused. The only chalk drawings I knew of were Ava's. The flowers she drew after school, the hearts with her name, and the little suns with smiling faces that brightened our corner of the block. They weren't offensive. They weren't messy. They were joy in color. I figured someone on the HOA was being overly particular, so I wiped them off, thinking that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. It was only the beginning. A few days later, Ava came inside looking pale and shaken. When I asked her what happened, she said, "That lady yelled at me." I knew exactly who she meant. Karen. Apparently, Ava had been playing with Ella by the community mailbox, tracing letters in the dirt with a stick when Karen marched over and snapped, "This isn't a sandbox. Go play somewhere else." My daughter, already sensitive to confrontation, had been too scared to respond. She just lowered her head and walked back home, dragging her walker slowly, as if her legs had suddenly grown heavier. I was furious, but I still tried to see the good in people. Maybe Karen was just having a bad day. Maybe she didn't realize how harsh she sounded to a little girl with trembling legs and bright eyes. I didn't want to assume the worst, not yet. So I let it go. I shouldn't have. Soon, the letters increased. A notice for overgrown hedges that weren't overgrown. A warning about improper trash bin placement, even though ours was aligned perfectly like everyone else's. We were told Ava's walker left tracks in the landscaping near the park. I laughed when I read that one, a sharp, humorless laugh that didn't feel like mine. Tracks? What kind of person notices the tracks of a child's mobility aid in the mulch and takes the time to complain? Still, I trimmed the hedges again. I triple-checked the trash bin. I started parking inside the garage instead of the driveway, just in case. I didn't want any trouble. We just wanted to be part of the community like everyone else. But it was becoming clear someone didn't want us there, and that someone was getting bolder. At the next HOA meeting, I decided to attend just to get a better sense of what was going on. I walked in with a polite smile, nodding at familiar faces from the block, trying to ignore the sudden hush that fell over the room when I entered. Karen sat at the front, clipboard in hand, flanked by two other board members. The way she looked at me, calculated, cold, made my skin crawl. I introduced myself, mentioned I'd recently received multiple notices, and asked if there had been any complaints filed that I could review. She leaned back in her chair and said, without blinking, "We've received multiple concerns from residents about repeated disruptions and rule violations coming from your household. We're just enforcing the standards equally." I asked what exactly those disruptions were. Her lips curled into the faintest smile. "Well, some have mentioned noise from the walker scraping on the pavement, and excessive time spent on common property." Common property? She meant the playground. She meant the bench I sat on while Ava played. I left that meeting stunned, not because of what was said, but because of how it was said with such smug certainty, as if she believed she had the authority to shrink our existence. After that, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. People who used to wave at us now gave half-hearted nods. A few started avoiding eye contact altogether. One neighbor, someone who had once shared pie with us during a community cookout, crossed the street rather than walk past us one afternoon. The whispers began too. I'd hear them faintly through open windows, snippets of conversations. "That girl, something's off." Or, "I heard the mom complains a lot." Ava picked up on it too. Kids who once played tag with her now hesitated to join her on the swings. She asked me, did I do something wrong? And I had to look into her eyes full of hurt and confusion and say, "No, baby, you're perfect. Some people just don't understand." I wanted to believe that would be enough, but even her smile had started to fade. One evening, as I was returning home from the grocery store, I saw Karen standing near our property line, arms crossed, staring at the side of our house. I approached her and asked as calmly as I could if everything was all right. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I just don't think this neighborhood is a good fit for families with special needs." My heart dropped. My fingers tightened around the grocery bag handles. "Excuse me?" I asked. She shrugged, unapologetic. "You might be happier somewhere with more resources." I don't remember what I said in response. I think I was too stunned to speak. The audacity of her words hung in the air like a bad smell. Offensive, suffocating, impossible to ignore. That night, I lay awake, wondering how it had come to this. We had done everything right, followed every rule, paid every fee, smiled through every insult. And yet here we were being pushed out not by force, but by precision. Death by 1,000 paper cuts, all under the shield of policy enforcement. Karen wasn't just a nosy neighbor, she was using the HOA as a weapon. And as much as I wanted to believe things would cool down, I couldn't ignore the feeling in my chest anymore. The one that told me this wasn't the worst of it. Not yet. This was just the opening act. The first signs of trouble. And deep down, I knew. If someone could resent a child simply for existing differently, what else were they capable of? After the first wave of warning signs, I hoped things would taper off, that maybe Karen had made her point and would retreat back into her cold indifference. But instead, her behavior began to change in more disturbing ways, escalating from subtle hostility to overt surveillance and aggression. It wasn't just letters anymore. It was her presence, constant, looming, invasive. She started showing up at the playground more often, standing off to the side with her arms folded tightly across her chest, sunglasses covering her eyes, lips pressed into a tight line. She wouldn't speak, wouldn't smile, wouldn't move. She'd just watch. At first, I convinced myself she just happened to be there, maybe walking her dog or checking the plants along the path. But it became a pattern. Whenever Ava played, Karen appeared. Not near the swings, not with other families, but always a few steps away, staring silently. Sometimes with a phone in her hand, pointed at Ava. I once walked up to her and asked Are you taking pictures of my child? Her reply was cold and clipped. I document everything that happens in this neighborhood for safety reasons. I remember standing there, stunned by the boldness of it, by the way she didn't even pretend to hide it. You can't just film children, I said firmly. She didn't answer. She just turned and walked away, like I wasn't worth her time. I filed a formal complaint with the HOA the next morning. Typed it all out, dates, times, screenshots of her stalking Ava, the incident at the mailbox, everything. I submitted it through their official portal, sent a copy via email, even hand-delivered one to the HOA president. No response. A week passed, then another. Finally, I got a generic email. Your concern has been noted. Thank you for your commitment to our community's standards. That was it. No investigation. No follow-up. Nothing. It felt like screaming into a void. Meanwhile, Karen got bolder. She once stood directly behind us while Ava sat on a swing, her phone up and recording, muttering, "These things just aren't safe. Someone's going to get hurt out here." I turned and shouted, "Leave us alone." And she stepped back, mock-offended, murmuring something about aggression and calling the board. The next day, I received a violation notice for hostile behavior at common areas. I couldn't believe it. She was turning the system against us again. The board was either blind, scared, or complicit, and we were becoming prisoners in our own neighborhood. Ava noticed everything. She stopped smiling as much. She asked to go to the playground less. When we did go, she'd cling to me, her eyes scanning for Karen before she'd dare step onto mulch. She asked me one night, "Why does that lady hate me?" I didn't know what to say. I told her it wasn't her fault, that some people just didn't understand kindness. But that answer didn't sit right with me. Because this wasn't just misunderstanding anymore. This was targeted cruelty. One afternoon, as I was helping Ava up the ramp to the slide, Karen walked by with a clipboard, pausing just long enough to say, "This playground isn't for people like her." I stopped cold. My hands trembled. My throat tightened. "What did you just say?" I asked, trying to stay composed. Karen raised an eyebrow. The HOA rules clearly state the equipment is intended for safe and active play. If a child can't use it properly, maybe it's not appropriate for them to be here. I was speechless. There was a venom in her voice that I hadn't heard before. Not passive aggression. This was full-blown dehumanization, thinly veiled under policy talk. I reported it again. Same process. Same silence. The HOA board was a fortress of polite apathy. Then came the photos. Printed images taped to our front door, placed under our windshield wipers, slipped into our mailbox. Pictures of Ava at the playground, close-ups of her walker wheels, wide shots of me sitting on the bench. No messages, just images. I felt nauseous, violated, afraid. This wasn't just bullying anymore. It was intimidation. I went to the police, but they said without a direct threat or evidence of harassment, they couldn't do much. Document everything. They advised, if something happens, we'll have a record. Something? Something had already happened. Our peace was gone, our child was scared, and I was walking around with a pit in my stomach every minute of the day. I installed cameras. I started keeping a journal of every interaction. But still, the fear lingered. It showed up in the way Ava would glance nervously over her shoulder or jump when dog barked too loud. It showed up in the way I triple-checked the locks at night and kept my phone in my hand during our walks. I had never considered that a neighbor, a middle-aged woman with pressed blouses and manicured lawns, could inspire this level of fear. But here we were living it. The worst part wasn't just Karen. It was the silence from everyone else. The neighbors who saw her confront Ava and said nothing. The ones who nodded to us in passing, but never asked if we were okay. The ones who whispered about causing drama at board meetings. I wanted to scream at them, "She's stalking a disabled child." But no one wanted to get involved. Conflict made people uncomfortable. And so they turned away. We were being isolated, erased, shamed into silence. Every day, it felt like the walls were closing in. I had hoped the HOA would protect us. Instead, they empowered our tormentor. Then, one Sunday afternoon, Ava said she didn't want to go outside anymore, not even to get the mail. It's not safe, she whispered. She's always watching me. That was the moment something inside me snapped. I held her close and promised her, we're going to fight back. No one gets to make you feel small. But the truth was, I didn't know how. All I knew was that something terrible was brewing. We had done everything right, played by every rule, reported every incident, and still we were being hunted. And the way Karen watched us, with that cold, unreadable stare, told me she wasn't done. Not even close. The escalation wasn't over. It was just gathering speed. And deep down, I fear the worst was yet to come. It was supposed to be an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the kind of late spring day where the sun hangs a little longer in the sky, and the breeze is just warm enough to carry the laughter of children across the playground. School had let out not long before, and Ava had been begging me all morning to let her stay after class to play a little longer with Ella. I had hesitated. There had been so much tension lately, so many strange stares, and too many coincidental run-ins with Karen that my gut was warning me against it. But Ava had looked up at me with her hopeful eyes and said, I want to feel normal today. Please? How could I say no to that? We packed a small snack, filled her water bottle, and made our way down to the playground behind the school. The sun was golden, casting long, soft shadows across the yard, and for a few moments I let myself believe it really was just another carefree afternoon. That was my mistake. Ava was radiant, full of light, her laugh carrying into the breeze as she moved between the swing set and the small bridge with her walker. She was trying to climb the ramp on her own again, something we'd been practicing for weeks. Each small step was a battle for balance, but she was determined and I was proud. Ella cheered her on, clapping and shouting, You got this, Ava? And for once, there were no rude glances, no muttered comments, just the sound of childhood. I sat on the bench nearby, a safe distance that gave her independence, but close enough to catch her if she stumbled. I had even taken out my phone to snap a photo of her halfway up the ramp, the look of pure joy on her face too beautiful not to capture. It would be the last photo I took that day. I saw her out of the corner of my eye, Karen. She wasn't walking. She was standing near the chain link fence at the edge of the school property, partially hidden behind a tree. Her arms were crossed, her head tilted just slightly, and something about the way she stared made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I quickly put my phone down and tried to focus on Ava again, but my heart had already begun to race. I scanned the area, no other parents in sight, no school staff lingering. Just my daughter, her friend, and the woman who had spent the past few months making our lives unbearable. I stood up slowly and began walking toward the playground, my eyes locked on Karen. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. She just kept staring at Ava. Ava, unaware of anything, had reached the top of the ramp and turned around proudly. Mommy, I did it by myself, she yelled, beaming. I smiled back, clapping, trying to match her joy, even as the knot in my stomach twisted tighter. You did, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you. That's when I noticed Karen's hand move. She reached into her large tote bag and pulled something out. At first, I thought maybe it was a phone again, ready to record another twisted version of reality. But it wasn't. It was black, solid, heavy. My brain didn't register what I was seeing until it was too late. A gun. I froze for a split second. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, to scream, but my body locked in place. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. She raised the weapon with eerie calmness, both hands wrapped around it, her eyes still locked on Ava. No! I screamed, lunging forward, but the sound of the gunshot cut through the air like lightning cracking the sky. A single, sharp, unforgiving bang. Time stopped. Ava screamed and crumpled. Instantly, her walker clattering down the ramp beside her. Ella shrieked, turning to run. My knees buckled. I ran to Ava, dropping to the ground as I pulled her into my arms. Blood, warm, red, seeping through her dress near her abdomen. Her little hands trembled, eyes wide with terror, lips parted but silent now. It hurts, she whispered. Mommy, it hurts. My hands pressed against the wound, desperate to stop the bleeding. I screamed for help, my voice ragged, raw, unrecognizable. Call 911. Someone help. She shot my baby. Karen stood in the same position, the gun now lowered, her expression disturbingly neutral. No remorse. No panic. She didn't move to help. She didn't even blink. When a neighbor from across the street came running toward us, shouting in horror, Karen simply pointed and said coldly, "She ran at me." I was scared. The words didn't make sense. My daughter couldn't run. She could barely walk. She had a pink walker and butterfly stickers. She had just finished climbing a ramp. She was 9. How could she say she felt threatened? The first police car screeched around the corner less than 3 minutes later, lights flashing, tires skidding against the pavement. Officers jumped out, guns drawn, shouting commands. For a second, I thought they were going to aim at me, at us, until one of them saw Ava on the ground and ran to help. Shot in the abdomen, entry wound left side. I heard one of them shout into his radio. Another officer restrained Karen, who didn't resist, didn't speak, just stared as though she were above it all. I could hear Ella crying behind me, someone trying to comfort her. But all I could see was Ava's pale face, her blood on my hands, her tiny body trying so hard to stay conscious. The paramedics arrived next, and I was pulled away as they loaded Ava onto a stretcher. "We need to go now," one of them yelled. I screamed to ride with her, climbed into the back of the ambulance, and held her hand as they rushed us to the hospital. Her grip was weak, but her eyes stayed open, flickering with fear and pain and something else, betrayal. She had been shot by a grown woman in broad daylight, on a playground, for existing. My daughter, who had never harmed a soul, who had smiled at the very woman who pulled the trigger, was now fighting for her life. At the hospital, everything moved like a blur. Nurses shouted codes. A doctor barked out orders. I was pulled into a waiting room, covered in her blood, my mind racing through every moment of that afternoon. How had we gone from celebration to this? A detective arrived soon after, asking questions I could barely process. Had there been any previous threats? Did you see the weapon before the shot? Do you have security footage? I gave them everything I could between sobs, every letter, every incident, every ignored complaint. They listened closely, faces grim, scribbling notes. One of them finally said what I had been silently screaming inside. This wasn't an accident. We're treating this as an attempted homicide. Back at the scene, Karen had been arrested, handcuffed, and taken away, though not before she repeated her claim. She charged at me. I was afraid. Some neighbors backed her up at first, parroting her words, unsure, afraid of getting involved. But others started speaking up, those who had seen her harassment, who had received the same notices, who had watched her follow us for months. Stories began to emerge. Footage surfaced from a nearby security camera, capturing the moment she pulled the weapon, aimed, and fired, no charging child in sight. No threat, just cold, calculated violence. As Ava lay in surgery, I sat in a daze, replaying the moment over and over. The sun, the smile, the shot. I blamed myself for letting her stay longer, for not acting sooner, for underestimating how far hate can go when it wears a mask of civility. But deep down, I knew this wasn't my fault. It wasn't Ava's. It was Karen's, and the HOA board that empowered her, and the silence of those who chose comfort over conscience. That day changed everything. A place that once represented freedom and inclusion had turned into a battlefield. The same playground that had given Ava her confidence had nearly become her grave. All because one woman decided her version of the world didn't have space for a little girl with a walker. But what Karen didn't know was that Ava had more strength in her tiny frame than most people carry in their entire lives. She fought through that pain, through that bullet, and she survived. And from that moment on, this would no longer be a story about fear. It would be a story about truth and justice and making sure the world never forgets what happened on that playground. The hours after the shooting felt like living underwater, everything muffled, surreal, and slowed to an agonizing crawl. Ava made it through the surgery. The bullet had torn through muscle and tissue, dangerously close to her kidney, but the doctors were optimistic. I remember clinging to the surgeon's words as if they were oxygen. She's stable. We're monitoring her closely. But stable didn't feel like enough. Nothing could erase the image of her small body lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to tubes, her skin pale, eyelids fluttering with each faint groan. I held her hand all night, brushing her hair back, whispering stories into her ear just to keep myself from breaking. The nurses were kind, offering quiet comfort, but their faces gave away what they didn't say out loud. This wasn't just an accident. It was something unthinkable, something evil. Word of the shooting spread quickly through the community. Local news outlets picked it up within 24 hours. The initial reports were cautious, filled with vague language, an altercation, a dispute involving an HOA member, a firearm discharged on school property. But behind those sterile headlines was the horrifying reality that a child had been shot on a playground in cold blood, and that her shooter, respected member of the HOA board, claimed she had acted in self-defense. That lie, that disgusting, shameless lie, cut deeper than the bullet. Karen told police that Ava had rushed her, that she felt cornered, that she panicked. She painted my daughter, my disabled, walker-using 9-year-old daughter, as a threat. And to my disbelief, some people believed her. The HOA issued a statement 2 days later. It was filled with polished legalese and empty sympathy. We are cooperating fully with authorities and deeply regret the tragic events that unfolded. While we await further investigation, we ask the community to refrain from speculation. It was a slap in the face. No mention of Ava. No denouncement of violence. No distancing themselves from Karen. If anything, it read like a veiled defense. And then, unbelievably, the board suspended our HOA access card pending review of recent hostile behavior. Us, the victims, as though we were the problem. I couldn't believe it. My hands shook as I read the email, rage pulsing through my veins. It was like we had stepped into an alternate reality where truth bent around privilege and cruelty wore a name tag. The days that followed were a blur of hospital visits, interviews with detectives, and legal consultations. I began compiling everything, every letter Karen had written, every complaint I had filed, screenshots of her stalking Ava, and the photos she left on our door. I organized it all in a binder thick enough to slam a door shut with. The detectives were kind, and I could see in their eyes that they knew we weren't just some family crying wolf. Still, the legal system moved slowly. Karen had been arrested but was released on bail the same night. That image, her walking out of the police station like it was just another inconvenience, haunted me. How could she sleep at night? How could someone capable of shooting a child be out on the street, sipping tea, checking her mail, as if nothing had happened? Then came the inevitable. I saw her. It was a week after the shooting. I was back at our house briefly to grab clothes for Ava, and as I stepped outside with a suitcase in hand, there she was, standing on her porch, arms crossed, watching me. Our eyes locked. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She smirked. That smirk, it nearly undid me. I snapped. I marched across the lawn and stopped right at the edge of her property line. "What kind of monster are you?" I shouted, my voice shaking with rage. "You shot a child. You lied to the police. You nearly killed my daughter." Karen raised an eyebrow, her tone flat and practiced. "She shouldn't have rushed me. You people bring your chaos everywhere you go." I couldn't breathe. "You people?" I asked, barely able to speak. She shrugged, smug. "Some of us moved here for peace, not special needs drama." That was it. That was the moment I saw her for who she really was. Not just a bitter neighbor or a control-obsessed board member, but a woman whose hatred had metastasized into something lethal. I stepped closer but stopped myself. "You don't get to erase her. Not this time. The world is going to see what you did." I filed a restraining order that afternoon, and thankfully, it was granted quickly. The school banned her from all grounds. Our lawyers sent formal letters to the HOA and the county. Still, the damage had been done. Ava couldn't sleep without nightmares. She'd wake up screaming, clutching her stomach, gasping for air. Her innocence had been shattered, stolen by someone who believed a pink walker and a soft voice were somehow offensive to her warped worldview. And for what? To prove a point? To maintain control? To silence us? But in the midst of all that pain, something shifted. Support began pouring in. Neighbors who had been silent started speaking up. One woman came to the hospital with a bouquet and tears in her eyes, whispering, "I'm so sorry. I was scared of her too." A father shared security footage from his doorbell camera that captured Karen walking through the neighborhood, muttering about getting rid of the problem family. Suddenly, we weren't alone anymore. The truth was gaining traction. And Karen? Her lies were beginning to unravel. Still, nothing could prepare me for the moment Ava opened her eyes after 10 days and said, "Mom, is the lady gone?" My heart shattered all over again. I held her and promised her something I wasn't sure I could deliver. "She'll never hurt you again." I had no idea if that was true. But I knew one thing: I wouldn't stop until justice found her. Because no child should ever be afraid to play. No mother should have to shield their child from bullets instead of bad weather. And no Karen should ever be allowed to weaponize fear behind the shield of an HOA. This wasn't just about our family anymore. This was about every family who's ever been silenced, every neighbor who's been bullied, every child who's been made to feel like a burden instead of a blessing. And I was done being afraid. Karen had fired a bullet, but she lit a fire, and I was going to make sure it burned through every lie she'd ever told. The investigation that followed moved like a slow, heavy tide, steady, deliberate, and burdened by bureaucracy. But unlike the silence and dismissal we had encountered before, this time there was momentum. The shooting had drawn too much attention to be swept under a rug. A child had been shot in broad daylight at a school playground. People were asking questions, reporters were circling, and, most importantly, the community was waking up. It began with a knock on the hospital room door. Two detectives, Sergeant Mitchell and Officer Perez, walked in, notepad in hand, and sat down beside me with serious, focused expressions. They explained that the initial statement given by Karen was under review due to inconsistencies. "We've interviewed some of the other parents who were nearby," Mitchell said. "Her version isn't lining up." I nodded. I had told them that from the beginning. Still, something in their tone hinted that more was coming. Something significant. 2 days later, I got the call that changed everything. A neighbor, Mr. Trent, who lived in the house directly across from the playground, had come forward with video footage. His home security system, positioned on a second-story balcony, had captured the entire incident from a high angle. He'd reviewed it after hearing about the shooting, unsure if it showed anything important. What he discovered shook him to his core. The video clearly showed Ava standing still at the top of the ramp, holding on to her walker. Karen was behind the tree, watching her. And then, slowly and deliberately, she pulled the handgun from her bag, stepped forward, raised it, and fired. No rush, no sudden movement, no charging, just pure, calculated violence. The footage was undeniable, crystal clear. It was the final nail in the coffin of Karen's fabricated defense. I was asked to come down to the station to view the footage, sitting in that room, watching my daughter's nearly final moments play out on a grainy screen was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But I forced myself to watch, to feel every second, to burn it into my memory, because the world needed to know exactly what had happened. And when the footage ended, both detectives sat silently for a beat. Then Sergeant Mitchell said, "This changes everything. We're reclassifying this as a targeted act of violence. She's going to be charged with attempted murder." Karen was arrested the following morning, not at her home, but at a cafe downtown, where she was sipping coffee and reading a magazine, as though her life hadn't just imploded. Officers surrounded her and read her rights. The news spread quickly. Headlines changed from dispute at local playground to HOA member charged with attempted murder of disabled child. The weight of the truth began crashing down like a wave. No longer could she hide behind her carefully curated image of order and respectability. She was exposed. Her cruelty, her lies, her dangerous obsession with control laid bare for the world to see. The community's response shifted almost overnight. Those who had stayed silent before were now speaking loudly, furiously. Parents who had once looked away began sharing their own stories. One mother recounted how Karen had berated her son for riding his scooter too close to her lawn. Another neighbor showed text messages where Karen bragged about documenting families she didn't like. The HOA board, now under scrutiny, tried to distance themselves. They issued a second statement, this time more desperate and defensive. The actions of Ms. Karen Wells were her own and do not reflect the values or policies of the HOA board. We are cooperating fully with law enforcement. It was too late. The damage had been done. They had ignored every warning, dismissed every complaint, enabled a woman who had terrorized families under the guise of neighborhood standards. Now, they were scrambling to save face. The detectives continued their investigation, digging into Karen's history. They discovered she had previously been fined in another community for harassment, but had moved before action could be taken. There were no prior criminal charges, just a pattern of intimidation, meticulously hidden behind homeowner complaints and procedural loopholes. But this time, the evidence was irrefutable. The DA announced they would be pursuing a full trial with charges including attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, and endangerment of a minor. The court date was set, and a protective order was granted barring Karen from any contact with our family. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt since the day of the shooting. Justice, not peace, because nothing could erase what had happened, but a sense that we weren't invisible anymore. That Ava's voice mattered, that the truth had triumphed over lies. But even as that feeling settled into my bones, I knew this was only the beginning. The legal process would be long and grueling. There would be courtrooms and cross-examinations, and Karen's defense would undoubtedly try to spin new versions of the same tired story. But we had something they didn't. The truth, the footage, the voices of a community that had finally opened its eyes. And Ava? She was still healing, physically and emotionally. But when I told her that the police had arrested the woman who hurt her, she looked at me with her big brown eyes and asked, "Is she gone forever?" I squeezed her hand and said, "She's not going to hurt anyone else ever again." It was the truth as much as I could promise it, because this time the world was watching, and we weren't backing down. The day Karen's charges were made public, everything changed. The story that had started as a whisper in our neighborhood erupted across local news, then regional, and eventually national headlines. Disabled child shot at playground by HOA board member, self-defense claim debunked by security footage, mother fights back after daughter targeted by HOA harassment. The headlines were brutal, but they were honest. The truth was finally being shouted louder than Karen's lies. Within days, social media caught fire. Thousands of people, mothers, educators, disability advocates, even veterans, shared their outrage, disbelief, and heartbreak. Hashtags like #JusticeForAva and #EndHOAAbuse trended in our state. People who had never met Ava were sending handmade cards to the hospital. Others offered pro bono legal support. A retired judge even penned an op-ed titled, "When Power Corrupts a Playground," calling for Karen's immediate prosecution and for a complete audit of the HOA. The public pressure became unbearable for the board. At first, they tried to stay neutral, still clinging to the illusion of impartiality. They issued a lukewarm sympathy statement that read more like a damage control memo. But the community wasn't buying it anymore. Parents began attending board meetings en masse, demanding accountability, not just for Karen, but for every person who enabled her. They brought signs. They brought stories. One by one, neighbors stood up and told the board exactly what they had ignored: the pattern of bullying, the misuse of power, the culture of silence. It wasn't just about Ava anymore. Karen had been a symptom of a deeper sickness, an HOA that had stopped protecting families and started policing them. The final straw came during a public town hall. I had been invited to speak, and though I was exhausted, heartbroken, and still running on the emotional fumes of watching my daughter recover day by day, I went. I stood in front of a packed room, every chair filled, news cameras pointed in my direction, and I spoke from a place I didn't even know existed inside me. I told them about the chalk drawings that were erased, the fines we received, the phone that was pointed at my daughter like a weapon long before the gun ever was. I told them how Karen had whispered poison in meetings, how the board had dismissed our pleas, and how their inaction had nearly cost a child her life. I held up the walker Ava had used that day, still dented from a fall, and said, "This is what she called a threat. This is what you all chose to ignore." There was silence after I finished, and then thunderous applause. Not because what I said was poetic or polished, but because it was real. Unfiltered pain. Undeniable truth. The next day, 3 board members resigned. Within a week, the HOA president stepped down, and a special election was scheduled. Karen's house, once pristinely maintained, was now surrounded by protest signs and guarded by sheriff's patrol cars. Her arrest had become a symbol, not just of her own twisted actions, but of the need for reform in every neighborhood that had let someone like her flourish unchecked. The district attorney officially charged Karen with 4 felonies: attempted murder, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, endangering a minor, and hate crime enhancement. Her self-defense claim was thrown out after the footage went public. The judge, in the arraignment hearing, called the video one of the most disturbing acts of premeditated violence I've seen in 20 years of service. Bail was denied this time. Karen was placed in custody until trial. And the first time Ava smiled again after the shooting was the night I told her that. "She's not going home?" she asked. I shook my head. "Not anymore." Ava nodded softly and whispered, "Good." Justice, though slow, was finally moving. Not just for us, but for every family who had ever been silenced, every child who had been told they didn't belong, every mother who was forced to explain cruelty to an innocent soul. Karen may have pulled the trigger, but the system that protected her was being dismantled piece by piece. And it started with a playground. It started with a little girl who just wanted to climb a ramp. And it would end with a reckoning that no HOA board or Karen could ignore again. In the weeks that followed the arrest, Ava began to heal, not just in the physical sense, but in ways far deeper than stitches and bandages could reach. Her body was still sore, her movements slower than before, but her spirit, that delicate, luminous part of her I had feared would never return, began to shine again piece by piece. She laughed a little louder each day. The first time she asked for her colored chalk again, I cried, not because of what had been taken from us, but because in that moment I realized what hadn't been. Karen had stolen our peace, she had robbed us of safety, but she hadn't destroyed the heart of my daughter. Ava was still here, still bright, still full of hope, and slowly she was reclaiming her world. But it wasn't easy. Ava had nightmares, terrible ones. She'd wake in the middle of the night, calling for me, her small hands trembling, her eyes darting around the room as if she were still back on that playground. She hated loud noises. She didn't want to walk alone, even with her walker. The sight of a large purse made her flinch. For a while, I couldn't even say the word school without seeing her retreat into herself. But therapy helped. A kind trauma specialist named Dr. Natalie worked with her twice a week, using gentle games and soft music to rebuild Ava's sense of safety. Ava liked her. "She listens without making me feel broken," she once said, and I knew exactly what she meant. What surprised me most, though, was the way the world showed up for us. Cards arrived from all over the country, handwritten letters from mothers, from veterans, from disabled adults who saw Ava as a hero. Strangers knitted her blankets. One little girl in Georgia sent her a handmade superhero cape with the words "strong" like AVA stitched into it. Churches, community centers, and advocacy groups invited us to speak, to share our story. I was overwhelmed, not just by the support, but by the clarity that came with it. We were not alone, and we never had been. We were part of something bigger, a collective voice rising against cruelty, against silence, against the kind of hate that hides behind neighborhood rules and petty power. Eventually, I made the decision to move. We left that neighborhood, not because we were running, but because we were choosing peace. Ava needed a fresh start. So did I. Our new home wasn't perfect, but it was filled with color and light. There were no fine notices in the mail, no passive-aggressive stares, no shadowy figures lurking behind fences, just neighbors who smiled without reservation, and a small park with a swing that squeaked with joy instead of fear. The first time Ava played there, she looked back at me and said, "This place feels happy." And I knew we had made the right choice. But I didn't move in silence. I didn't let Karen's story disappear into the background noise of another tragedy. I spoke. I wrote. I showed up at HOA conferences, school board meetings, and disability rights panels. I carried Ava's walker into every room like a banner, like a memory of what hate tried to do and what love refused to let happen. I told parents, don't stay silent. Don't let fear wear a cardigan and carry a clipboard. Don't wait for someone to get hurt. Speak, stand, protect the vulnerable. Because justice isn't just about punishment, it's about prevention. Ava still asks questions, sometimes hard ones, sometimes quiet ones. But now, she asks them with less fear and more curiosity. She still carries the scar, but she wears it like armor. And every time she laughs, really laughs, I hear the sound of resilience, of innocence reclaiming its space, of a little girl who fought back with every ounce of strength she had. Karen may have tried to break us, but she only taught us how to rise. And Ava? She's not just surviving, she's leading. Sometimes I still stand at Ava's bedroom door and watch her sleep, peacefully, quietly, surrounded by stuffed animals and drawings taped to the wall. It feels like a miracle, not because she's just alive, but because after everything, after the blood, the screams, the court hearings, the nightmares, she's still her. Joyful, curious, brave in ways I'll never be able to explain. This journey broke us in places I didn't know we could be broken, but it also revealed the kind of strength I didn't know existed in a mother, in a community, and in a child. When Karen pulled that trigger, she didn't just aim to end Ava's safety. She fired at the very idea that someone like Ava belonged. But Ava does belong, and she always will. Not because someone gave her permission, but because she claimed her space in this world with love, resilience, and grace that Karen could never understand. This experience changed me. It forced me to look at the world differently. I used to believe that kindness would be enough, that following the rules would keep us safe. But I learned that silence doesn't protect the innocent, it empowers the cruel. I learned that evil doesn't always come wearing masks or breaking into homes. Sometimes it's dressed neatly, smiling at HOA meetings, writing up violations about chalk on sidewalks while quietly sowing hatred. And I learned that when the system fails to speak up for the vulnerable, we have to become the voice ourselves. We have to be louder than their lies, braver than their threats, and stronger than their fear. If you're watching this and you've been made to feel small, unwanted, or unsafe by your HOA or by anyone in power, please hear me when I say this. You are not alone. You are not wrong for demanding dignity. You are not dramatic for wanting peace. Whether your battle is visible or buried under piles of paperwork and silence, it matters. You matter, and your story deserves to be told. We didn't ask to be part of this fight, but we're here now, and we're not backing down. Because if telling our story means one less child has to grow up afraid, if it means one more mother finds the courage to speak, then it's worth every second of the pain. Ava is healing. We are healing. And we are moving forward, scarred but stronger than ever. If you've ever felt powerless in an HOA, you're not alone. This was our story. This is the HOA stories. Like, comment, and share if you've lived through your own HOA nightmare. Let the world know. We see you, we believe you, and your voice matters.